I want to welcome everybody to CAFTA. Again, we have Matt Hintz, Senior Application Developer at Soliant Consulting, and he's presenting on what's in a name, naming conventions, and FileMaker. Go ahead, Matt. It's all yours.
Great. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. All right. As Phil told you, my name's Matt Hintz. I'm a Senior Application Developer with FileMaker, with Soliant. I'm FileMaker 11 through 18 certified, and I'm not too far from you, actually. I'm up in the Milwaukee area, so thank you for welcoming me into your secret society here of CAFTA. A little bit about me. I have one son. His name is Jack. He just turned 2 on the 25th. He's a cute dude. Really like him. I also have a dog. His name's Zeppelin. This is him as a puppy. He's much bigger than this now. In my free time, I play in a local band with my brother, which I can't wait for things to get back to normal so I can start gigging again. Never realized how much I missed it. And there you can see at the bottom, my dog Zeppelin. He's a big boy now. He's about 100 pounds. He's a Bernese Mountain Dog. All right. So getting into this, what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk a little bit about naming conventions. We're going to go through some examples that Soliant uses for naming different naming conventions. We're going to talk about why we would want to use naming conventions, some of the challenges that come about when you do naming conventions, and then we're going to have some discussion about this. I kind of the big thing I want to kind of point out with naming conventions is it's not this isn't some rule book you have to follow. That we're saying Soliant does it right and no one else has a better idea on this, or and you shouldn't have that kind of view either. In general, you want to be open to sort of changing and revising naming conventions that you use in your FileMaker solutions. And the big part of it though is that you remain consistent when you have those conventions in place, and that you in some way are documenting and sharing and making that information available to your other developers that may be working on projects with you, or possible clients that you're working with as well. Sometimes it's helpful as well. So that's a good starting point. So where are some examples of where we may use naming conventions? Well, in FileMaker, we'd use them in tables, the way we name the tables, the way we name fields, how we create and build our relationship graph, how we name our scripts, how we name scripts that are being called in, related to a script trigger. Maybe how we name variables is another thing that we would have a convention for. We also then have the way that we name layouts or objects that are on those layouts. And another area would be value lists. Obviously, there's other areas we could talk about: custom functions, the way we name user accounts maybe would be a thing, user groups, within FileMaker. There's a lot of different areas, but I thought these would be the most applicable to most people, as these are probably tools and features of FileMaker that you've used. Again, I'm just going to throw out a disclaimer. One, this isn't everything that Soliant does, and I would say that even as a company, we're not completely consistent about this, but it is at least a starting point, a recommended way of handling this. But there is no real right answer to naming conventions. It's really whatever you decide to come up with, and find your own reasoning for why you want to have a specific convention in place. But be flexible to change, iterate on this process, talk to other people, see how they do things, which is, I think, part of what I'm trying to accomplish here today, is kind of hear, what do other people do? And maybe I'll hear something and go, huh, that's a pretty good idea. So something that we can take under consideration. So far so good. Let me hop over here. So first we're gonna kind of talk about tables, how in particular we like to name tables here. Table names are only going to use characters A through Z, 0 through 9 for us, and we use underscores to separate them, to separate out words, and we recommend having it begin with a letter. Some of these things have to do with being compatible with other database systems. Maybe we're offering FileMaker as an ODBC data source in some scenarios. And then in our scenario, we also like to prefix our tables with some sort of abbreviation, and those abbreviations then are used on our relationship graph, which I'll show an example of those in a moment here. And again, this is, I think, pretty obvious. I think all of us probably do this, but when we name our tables, we want to be descriptive of what the table is storing, what information is in there. So no generic names like table number 3 are recommended. And there's also, this is a hotly debated topic, some people like to name their tables in the plural or the singular form. So employees and departments, or employee and department. Both I think are acceptable. I guess if it was me, I always do the singular because it just kind of makes more sense to me when I say employee table as opposed to employees table. But it's really just as long as you're consistent, I think that that's fairly acceptable here. So I'm going to hop out here, and here's some examples that you can see how we do our conventions. But let me actually show you some real world examples of this real quick. So let me open up so I made just a little demo file. It's pretty uneventful, but I thought it'd be a good way to sort of facilitate some of this conversation and topic. Everyone should be seeing a managed database dialog. Is that a go here? Looks like it should be good. So in this scenario, I've just created 3 basic tables: a company table, a contact table, and an invoice table. Each table has its own unique prefix, COM in this case, CON, INV for invoice. Some people will recommend maybe differentiating these a little bit more, maybe do a CTN or a CMP for company, some kind of way to kind of distinguish and separate them out here. We'll see where this becomes useful in our relationship graph in a little bit. One of the big advantages I see to having sort of these abbreviations or these prefixes in front is for type ahead. If you're in the relationship graph and you have many tables and many table occurrences, the big benefit is being able to, to be able to quickly type ahead on your keyboard. I can type in COM on the relationship graph and quickly get myself there. So that's a nice benefit there of using this sort of abbreviation. Obviously, there'll be times when this list might get pretty long and you might have to get a little creative with some of your abbreviations, but 3 letters, maybe 4 is, I think, is enough to kind of keep you going. So that's some ideas of how we maybe do some of our naming for our tables here. Let me hop back into my slides. While I'm flipping back, any quick thoughts or questions on that anyone wants to get out of their system? Any? All right, I'll take a drink of my coffee here. All right, so that's kind of an overview of sort of how we would name tables, and gives you sort of a starting point. And just like I said, you'll see in a little bit when we talk about the relationship graph where that sort of concept with that prefix and that naming convention comes into play as well. So for our fields, we generally recommend not using any spaces. We use underscores and or camel case with our naming convention. Optionally, some fields, for example, some certain types of fields, we like to do some additional notation. I've been told this is called Hungarian notation. I don't know if this is specific to a country or not, but I guess it's a thing. But I will use these in terms of these particular fields. Now there's many more notations you can add. You can go down to whether it's a text field or a number field. But I like to use these particular ones because they do have performance implications in many instances. So for example, global fields, we will add an ending of an underscore G. Summary fields, underscore S, underscore R, calculation, and underscore U for an unstored calculation or an unstored field in some way. So those are some ideas I like to throw out because it's sometimes good to know when you're adding a layout to, say, a relationship that you're editing, to be able to know, oh, I'm trying to use a summary field in this relationship. Maybe I need to rethink this, or oh, this is an unstored calculation. And so then that way, by having it be right in the name, you're getting some additional metadata, some additional context of what's going on with that field beyond just this is the current employee number or something like that. You get a little more insight into what that field's actually doing. Digging a little bit further here, some of our naming conventions related to keys. This probably could be its own topic for about 10 or 15 minutes. When I came to Soliant, the concept of using our key fields, or our primary key fields, whether those are UUIDs or sequential serial numbers. The ID field, we use a field just called ID for each table. You could take this further and add some additional detail, maybe to say that this underscore ID underscore primary or something. But this gives us a quick and easy way to know what the primary key is in our table. in this particular case. Now, when I came to Soliant, I did not use this naming convention, so it did take me some time to get used to it. I was used to the double underscore PK for primary key and then a description of that field in a primary sense. And I used underscore FK underscore, contact ID or something like that for my foreign keys from other tables. But in the case of Soliant, we use ID, and then so that's our first one here for using primary keys. The second one on the list is an ID underscore contact. That's to indicate a primary key from another table, sometimes known as a foreign key. So that's how we'll name those fields, and that kind of bundles them and groups them all together in one area. And again, another example of type ahead quickness, I can just type in ID when I'm looking at my fields in a table, and boom, I'm right there with the first couple ones. So additional field types, I think I'm going to hop out for this a little bit so we can see some examples, so some real fields here. So in this particular table, I have my contact table. I have my ID fields, and very basic. I haven't added too many other fields into this. Maybe I can add a first name, maybe name first. Sometimes I like to do this too with my naming conventions. Like if these fields are kind of meant to be together, where it's a first and a last name, I'll kind of reverse it. So it's the kind of the main piece and then the last, first and last name. So just some other ideas. Notice I'm doing camel case, no spaces. I could add some underscore maybe into this. Maybe I have a calculated full name, so I could do name full underscore C. Make a full kind of a calculated one here. Very basic. I'm not doing too much fancy stuff here. So you get the idea. You can, that way I know, okay, this field is a calculation. It is stored in this scenario. Then we also have what we call housekeeping fields or developer fields. So for example, these are sort of audit trail fields. We recommend having these in every table, regardless of whether or not users or your client asks for them or you need them necessarily. They can aid in troubleshooting or tracking down specific user, just call them nefarious users. So this is kind of some examples of some of our housekeeping fields. We like to prefix them with a double Z underscore so that they kind of flow to the bottom in our alphabetical listing here. That provides some additional ways of kind of be able to separate out certain fields from each other. If we also have, for example, maybe some global fields like maybe current user ID or something, maybe there's some use for this, and let's say it's a global, I'll use my postfix here of a underscore G, and I'll just make this a global field as well. So now I can see I've got this sort of housekeeping internal developer field that is an underscore G global field. I could, if I wanted to specify further, I could do GT for text, so I know it's a text field. There's some, some good reasoning for wanting to denote whether or not a field is a number versus text for data compatibility, maybe between different fields. So all things to consider. Let me see, let me check my notes. Any thoughts or questions so far on the exciting world of naming conventions?
Looks like no questions so far.
Okay, cool. I will keep on trekking. All right, next area, relationship graph. So we at Soliant, we use the anchor buoy method of our relationship graph structure. We generally recommend this for a few reasons. One, and I'll show in my example, the ability for us to know what tables are related to the table that we're currently on. So we also have a clear understanding of the hierarchy that we're looking at from the current, say, the layout we're on or the script context that we're calling something from. It also helps making meaningful naming conventions possible in that we're able to see the parents, or I guess they call it by the terminology. On the left side, we see the CMP company table occurrence. That's our anchor, and each one of these little table occurrences off of here is a buoy off of that. So they're all kind of tied together and they float together, and just one little happy table occurrence group. So we'll sometimes call those TOGs, TOGs. And so the way I generally try to think about this is each kind of major entity is going to have its own table occurrence group in most scenarios. And we build off of that. There are maybe some possible drawbacks here is that relationships or functionality that may be available from one context on another layout or table. You may have to recreate that when you have another layout based off of another set of data. Another layout possibly. So this is not necessarily, there may be some drawbacks or considerations you have to be aware of, but even from a performance standpoint, we like Anchor Buoy because there is a performance drag to going to the what we would call a spider graph or the everything connected or the mess relationship graph. If everything's connected, there is some performance degradation to loading a layout initially. There is some level of those related table occurrences from your table occurrence group that are loaded or rendered in some way within FileMaker. Obviously, the more that you add into your graph and the more that is interconnected, that is going to have performance hit. But again, that's the benefit of Anchor Buoy. If you get to a point where you've built a massive table occurrence group, say for your company, you can make the decision to create a new table occurrence group for your company table and be able to start building again that maybe is specific to a mobile app, a different module, or a different set of users possibly, or maybe it's something for a website. Maybe you have some web backend connections that you're making. Using this sort of Anchor Buoy methodology and model we found is pretty flexible and powerful and in the benefit of performance here. So let me hop out and kind of show some examples of why this naming convention is useful in a relationship, in our relationship graph. I've added some color. You don't need to do color, but I like color. I don't like looking at gray stuff all the time. So what I've done is I've color coordinated each base table. So in this case, my company are all orange, all my contacts are green, and my invoice table is blue. So I've tried to, just to make it a little bit easier for everyone to see, maybe if we've got some smaller screens in your case here. So what I've done up to this point is basically provided sort of a way to sort of break these relationships down. Now, say for example, I'm looking at my layout here. I've got this contact layout that I'm working with. I've gone into layout mode, and I want to see related tables or I want to pull data from companies, some related fields. I can quickly notice, and now this is probably newer in FileMaker 17, 18. Some of our naming conventions have been around before that, but we can see very clearly that the related tables that I have for company and invoice are separated out. I can clearly see that based off my naming convention of starting with CON, then underscore COM for company, and so on and so forth. I can also see, for example, that the invoice table occurrence here is a branch off of company. So it's not a direct relationship to my contact record. There's another hop that's occurring here, another relationship in place. So that sometimes may be important to realize and to be able to see here. But I can select now, and now I'm able to say add my field onto this layout that's related more simply, and I also see what tables are not related, which may not get me the desired results that I'm hoping for when I'm building this layout, this relationship on this side of things. Looks like the chat is popping up a little bit. Phil, do you want me to read them off, or do you want me to do it? What's your inclination for that? Oh, looks like Phil doing some chat. All right. Yeah, I would agree, Phil. Yeah, it's pretty much mandatory. I mean, if we come across, say, an existing solution that we're developing for a client, or sorry, someone else maybe has developed for a client and we're kind of taking over on that project, and we don't have Anchor Buoy in place, we will often, say to our clients, we advise moving to this model. And doing somewhat of a rewrite in scenarios. Sometimes that even if we have a client that's not doing Anchor Buoy, and it's not a very well formulated relationship graph, that might even be an indicator to us that maybe some kind of rewrite work needs to be done at a higher level, or a lower level even, I guess. So yeah, it kind of depends. In terms of, let's see, naming conventions. Like, I see anything else? Yeah, I think Phil answered that. Thanks, Phil. All right. So again, I'm just another screenshot, an example here. Seeing this relationship graph, we can see, for example, I'm seeing the address table, and I can see off of that, I don't have any related tables, but maybe down below I have the company table occurrence, and here I can see below, so I can kind of visually see with my eyes very quickly, just go down a list, I can see all the table occurrences that are related to CMP, the company table occurrence group, and they're all grouped together nicely. It's all sequential, so it's easier to kind of know, well, I'm looking for the invoice table occurrence that is in the CMP group. I can, I can do type ahead CMP underscore INV for invoice, or, I can, any other part of this part of the relationship graph, I'm able to quickly get around and find what I'm looking for and not try to remember maybe some long name of company, invoice all spelled out in big words, a lot of different pieces. Another piece I'll mention here too, what we do is in scenarios maybe where we have, let's see if I can get this right, more than one occurrence of a table within a group. So one example I would see in this visual here is contact. So I have CMP underscore CNT. I have one, two, three table occurrences that are based off my contact group. Well, actually, probably really just two. I kind of misread it a little bit. So the first one is, I wonder if I can get a little pointer on screen here. I don't know if I can. Yeah, maybe not. Doesn't look like I have a good way to do it when I'm in slide mode here. So try to follow along visually here, but I have CMP underscore CNT double underscore contact. So that's one table occurrence of the contact table. And in that same table occurrence group, I have a CNT primary contact, so, or prim. So what that's kind of showing to me is maybe there's a way that we're using the relationship graph to denote what contact is primary, and maybe that information is displayed in a certain context on that layout. So in that case, we're naming the table occurrence with that kind of identifier on the end there that's saying it's the primary contact. So that's one other way that we would kind of indicate this within our table occurrence names, so that we have a much more clear understanding of how this table occurrence may be used within this layout, within this relationship graph. You can see further down to some other examples. So like, for example, we have the invoice line item. So there's a INV underscore LISEL for selected. So maybe there's a certain way that we're building this layout where we can select line items on an invoice, and maybe it kind of has some fields that pull out additional information about that line item. And so that way we're kind of able to see, oh, okay, this is additional line item information that is somehow context specific within this table occurrence group. So you can see we try to, if we have maybe multiple descriptors that we need to put in there, where it's line underscore item underscore selected, we're able to kind of build that out a little bit further so we can make it a little clear, and we use underscores to separate that. We don't use spaces in our naming convention. But we use that so it's a little bit more easy to read, breaks it all a bit further, as opposed to maybe just doing camel case or some other kind of convention. Some other ideas or things I've seen in regards to this. Sometimes I've seen users use the pipe character. Let me show you that just real quick. Sometimes I've seen developers break it out with a pipe. So for example, in this example, instead of using the contact by company, I would do the pipe character, which is like a vertical bar look. Sometimes they'll do a double pipe. There's some benefits to this I've found. So for example, if you want to maybe rename just one side of this, you can double click a lot easier. You can also, so like for example, this is underscore. If I double click, it's not going to see that that pipe as a break. So that's another kind of way that may be a separator that you may use when it comes to relationship graph naming. Sometimes though, it gets kind of lost. It kind of makes it hard sometimes to see where the break is. Maybe you think this is a character of some sort. So there's pluses and minuses to every method, that kind of, but that's one other way I've seen that is also common for kind of separating these out. Let's see. Looks like Mark's got some ideas. Yeah, looks like Mark's using, he appends his descriptors at the end of the pipe. So yeah, company, contacts, invoices, yeah. Another question came through in the chat here, single versus double underscore. So the benefit to that then, very good question, thank you for asking, probably something I wanted to cover here. The benefit to doing a double underscore is, let me see if I can find a good context for that. Let me see, field picker probably, where can I show that? The big benefit is by doing the double underscore, maybe I'll just say it, is that I'm able to, it automatically floats my my anchor of the table to the top of my list of that table occurrence group. So one example would be here, say for example, let me change this. So my contact table occurrence graph here. just has a single underscore for my anchor, and then I have this, we may run into scenarios where our actual listing of our tables, and this isn't a good example here. I'm trying to think maybe in, I think maybe here possibly, I might be able to see it. Yeah, here. So here's a good example. So by not doing a double underscore after my CON for my anchor table, there's two benefits. Benefit one, I can tell that it's an anchor because it's double underscored, possibly. Sometimes it's hard to maybe see double underscores. But now we also see that my anchor is now not at the top, it's actually at the bottom of my list. And so that sometimes can make it difficult to identify the anchor or where it fits into sort of the hierarchy that we put into place with anchor buoy to say this is my anchor and these are all the buoys that kind of trail off of it from there. So that's why we do the double underscore. So another option there. Let me switch that back so I don't lose my mind. There we go, switching it back.
There's another question. Question about the dots, using dots or dashes or non-underscores.
Yeah, you know, it does add some complication in terms of, I think it's being caught up by Mike here, so thanks, Mike, for catching that in the chat. There might be some challenges regarding, you know, related to SQL or other maybe math functions or other compatibility with other data sources or other, well, if you're sharing your data out through FileMaker in other ways. So those are some things to be considered. You know, to think about when you're naming these. And obviously, these are things that we've kind of developed and we've brought out over the years, mostly because we've ran into these problems. We've seen issues with doing this naming convention or as opposed to another naming convention. And so a lot of what I'll talk about later on here is your naming conventions are born through experience and are born through the things you've done wrong or the things you've done right, maybe. And so often, you know, often that's something that we have to kind of think about is, you know, oh, maybe the dot syntax is useful. You know, as mentioned in the chat, so maybe the idea of using dot separators to separate things out, that's another way that you could go about doing it. My initial inclination thought is I often like to use my dot syntax when I'm using stuff that's related to JSON or JavaScript, so I'm able to kind of keep the JSON notation idea where they use dot notation within that realm of JavaScript and JSON. And so that's kind of a personal idea that I would say, but it's another way you can do it too. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. It all just kind of depends on what works for you and what lessons you've learned by your different naming conventions you've gone through. Maybe some of the questions, maybe there was some back and forth, the questions related to specific people, how they do things. Let's maybe open that up as a group discussion at the end, but maybe if you do have specific questions, these are all great questions, I appreciate them. But what I'm talking about now, those are things we can talk about as well. Right, I'll keep on going, and if there's any other things that you see, Phil, that are popping up that we want to address, let's do it. Scripting, so naming scripts is definitely another area that can be very open-ended for you. In terms of Soliant, we have some recommendations, conventions that we have because we do something in particular with our script naming. So when we create a script, some examples here, let me just kind of hop forward so you can see them. The way we name scripts, an example here is below we see test subscript 1, and then we do in the scenarios where we need to have parameters passed to a script, we will include the names of those parameters and whether or not they're required in the actual script name. This allows us to reuse code more easily, so kind of making our scripts modular. So say, for example, I have a script where I'm creating a new contact record, and maybe there's multiple instances where I would create a contact record. And I need to pass in certain information. I can know what I need to pass into that script to make it successful by just looking at the name of the script, but without having to dig into the script, be like, oh yeah, what were the script parameters that this is needed to make this run successfully? It allows you to be quicker, allows you to be more efficient with your scripting, and allows you to reuse code more easily, because if you're in the mindset of using script parameters and passing information into those scripts, it allows you to be able to be quicker and be able to know what information is going to be brought through and passed through that script. So for example, we see above, we see one example where there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different script parameters passed in this first one at the top. based off of our notation, we're not using a tilde, which is the squiggly line character you see in the bottom option. So since we don't append or prefix our parameters with this tilde, it means we're not, those are optional in that instance. So in the example, or the second example below, we only see the first two parameters are required. We separate our parameters with a semicolon to break them out. Now, we're very specific on this, that this needs to be at the end of the script name, that it needs to use the tildes, excuse me, and separated by semicolons because, and this is probably beyond the scope of this, but as a company, Soliant, we like to use some custom functions that allow us to quickly, based off the name of the script, expand and explode out those parameters and create variables for all those parameters that we pass. So that allows us to, one, name the scripts and name the parameters through this ability. It does require some additional functionality that we add into our solutions, which is passing in these custom functions. But once you get used to them, once you use them, and this is probably there's probably blog posts I could find that talk about this technique, but it basically allows you to, one, kind of keep your data in the appropriate data type. So for example, if you're passing a date field and you want to keep it as formatted as a date or as text or as a number or as a other data type, it helps you keep that data type intact as you pass it through your different scripts. And it also, again, makes it really easy. We can call one function after when we start running our script. And from that, all of our variables are then set that we have passed in as parameters. So it's a quick way to be able to do that. It saves us time in writing out all this out in the beginning of every script, all the parameters that are passed, what the values are getting set to. It also determines whether or not, it checks to validate to make sure we passed the correct parameters successfully. So those are all benefits to doing this model. I don't have a huge, great example of this in practice that I want to walk through in this. So I do leave it open to maybe some questions that people can ask. Maybe I can go to an example of an actual script just to see it in a name of a script. So here's one example where I have a script called create contact record. I'm using spaces, as you can see in it, and then I'm doing parentheses around my parameters. My parameter, I'd like it to be called ID company. So when the script gets called, it's going to be a, and next we'll talk about variables. It'll be a $ID company is how my variable is going to be named as it's passed through. And then I have an optional parameter of maybe the type for the contact, and maybe I want to add some additional specificity. And maybe it's type contact. What type of contact it is. Is it a customer? Is it a vendor? So there's a couple of different options there. Spaces are, I've seen this done both ways too, where the naming of the script, maybe you don't do spaces, you do camel case, or maybe you have a prefix, maybe there's context dependency that you want to put in front to say maybe it's contact or, dash contact. I've seen it kind of done both different ways here. There's a lot of different things you can do with naming of a script that can kind of denote it. There's no reason why particularly to do spaces or not do spaces. Maybe the one thing I can see of why we're doing spaces in our scripts, it makes it a little bit easier to read and more legible. And so often we will name scripts in sort of what the script is doing. And so sometimes our script names can get a little bit longer. And so we sometimes will have, create contact record, or maybe it's, run monthly financial report for accounting team or something. Maybe there's a longer name to it, and sometimes, so in this scenario, maybe we're seeing, trying to understand, breaking out, make it a little bit easier to read and understand from this context. There's possibly some reasoning too within our custom functions that we're using that are naming these parameters, that having spaces in it, and especially in the context of having them within our parameter passing that we're doing, to have spaces might be useful as well. So one question that came up there. I'd be interested in learning more about this script parameter technique. Yeah, actually, now I think about it, I think I wrote a blog post about this, shameless plug. I think I'll see if maybe Phil wants to dig it up, and we can maybe post it in the chat and maybe append it to the end of this video.
I'm looking for it now, so
yeah,
I'm looking for it now. I'll post it.
Yeah, I think I took was it Martha? Maybe it was Maka. Yeah, I think it was Maka. Maka was going to do or had done a DevCon session on this topic of different ways to pass parameters into scripting. And I sort of did a write-up on this then that talked about the different ways to pass scripts, parameters into your script. I think there's about 3 or 4 different methods that are there. Thank you, Phil. Sweet. I think there's a demo file, and I think all that stuff's fun. So cool. So moving on, that's kind of a way of doing it. Again, there's no hard and fast rule that you have to do it this way. This is just the way that we sort of have standardized this, and I'm sure that we have evolved these concepts and these ideas over time. Thank you, Phil. Great. Perfect. Very cool. So that's how we handle sort of passing in these naming conventions. So kind of, I'll keep things moving here. I got a few more different areas that we'll cover, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit more in specific where we're going over here. So the way we name variables. So the way we like to name our variables is that there's obviously, hopefully most of you know there are 2 types of variables. We have local variables or script variables, or there are, those 2 ways I can think of naming them. We like to name those with a lower camel case syntax. So for example, like I showed in my previous slide or my previous view, I had a ID or a $ ID company. So I knew it was the ID of a company that I was passing along my script there. We don't put any spaces in them, and I'm going to say I think FileMaker automatically does some work for you if you try to add spaces into your variable names. Taking a little bit of a leap there. Then we have global variables. Those are our $$ variables that we can pass. We like to name all of our global variables in uppercase and separate the words out with an underscore. Some examples I can show you, maybe here are some. So this, I think for us, it helps us understand, by doing in all caps, one, it means your variable is yelling at you. No, I'm just kidding. Does not mean they're yelling in this scenario, but it allows us to really solidify that this is a sort of like a user-specific global variable that they're using throughout their session while they're in FileMaker, and that it sort of gives us some way to sort of more visually identify that they are different than the single $. I think you could make the argument that just seeing a double $sign versus a single $sign maybe is enough for you to visually see that this is a global versus a local variable. That's clearly up for debate and can be a topic. And again, it's up to you how you decide to influence and build these. But this is a way that we kind of will name our variables and gives us a way to be able to see that. And again, this reinforces our custom functions and our passing of script parameters. So another part of this maybe we'll talk about later on too is the idea that your naming convention should not contradict each other at different phases within it. So if you're passing script parameters in one way and you're naming your variables a different way, maybe that's something you want to consider, maybe unifying that because there is some relationship between the passing of your parameters and making them variables within your script. And then also, how other variables maybe are set within your script that are not passed as parameters. And being consistent makes it easier for you to remember what your naming convention is, which is, we'll talk about some of the challenges here is, what is my naming convention? What do I actually do when I name a variable or name a script or whatever it may be? And so that gives us some capability there to see those variables from there. Let's see, I'll keep on chugging along here just for the sake of time, and then we can kind of maybe open up some discussion at the end here. So when it comes to naming layouts, we try to separate our layouts out into sort of 2 groups. Some layouts we have maybe are what I would coin user layouts. These are layouts maybe that users are interacting with on a regular basis. Maybe they're available in the layout drop-down menu. Maybe you give those available. So in that scenario, we will name these layouts very what we would consider user-friendly. So 2 examples I give here, we have a contact list and a contact detail. Those are 2 layout names that we may run into. So those are 2 ways that we maybe make user-friendly layouts, and I'll show some examples of that within our layout context when we're looking at our layout window, layout menu. And then what we have, we'll often call developer layouts. We will prefix those with a dev underscore to just denote that these are developer layouts. We'll often group those developer layouts together in sort of a folder Again, that's probably more of a best practice, not necessarily a naming convention, but this would be the naming convention that we would have. And this is at the bottom is more probably sort of a best practice, not necessarily a part of our naming convention, but maybe it helps you kind of understand the lines that we're drawing between a end user available layout and a developer available layout. So let me hop out real quick and I'll kind of show that to you. So I'm going to go to my file, manage layouts, and I've just made a very small set of layouts here. So maybe what I have here at the top is sort of this breakdown of my user layouts are up at the top here. Maybe I could even make another folder here and we'll call it user accessible in some way. I could maybe put those at the top, maybe uncheck that. So those layouts are available. Maybe I'm using some separators to kind of separate things out here. I've grouped so I have a contact detail. The benefit here, let's say for example, I need an invoice detail layout. I can duplicate a layout really quickly. I can call it invoice detail. I can rename it real quick. I can go to invoice, change the table occurrence. So I show records from my invoice table here. And I'm quickly going in and creating these new layouts based off of maybe some existing modeling that I've done with the way I generally will make a detail, or you got your form view, as some people would call it, or a list view. Maybe I've already got some ability built into that. So this gives an example where I can quickly say, oh yeah, I'm gonna, I need to make an invoice detail. So maybe I'll base it off my contact detail. I can quickly duplicate it and then obviously start work on my layout. As you probably know, these checkboxes next to each layout determine their availability to users in the layout menu here. That's probably a whole other best practice topic of discussion of whether or not you even use this. There might, this gives you users ability to navigate between different layouts without really maybe any context where you're putting rules on them. Maybe they only need to see certain contexts that are assigned to them, or they only need to see certain, or maybe they're not supposed to see invoices at all. There are some drawbacks using this menu, but again, if you have a very simple solution, maybe it's your home recipe database that you're keeping track of in FileMaker, and you're the only person in it, it's not a big deal. Maybe there's a good reason here you can then use this layout menu. But in general, like what we say, we will hide those developer layouts. Often the reason being for that is when we are hiding developer layouts, sometimes we use those developer layouts to see a lot of fields. We will go into our developer layout and we'll throw all of the fields on this layout, or most of them in a context maybe. And we'll make these fields available that really should not be available to users in other contexts. A lot of these fields maybe are hidden or they're developer related, and we really don't want a user to be able to go in and just say, actually, this was created by Phil. Now I've put in other protections in place, so it allows, but some things to consider. Maybe there's certain fields that users should not be controlling from these dev layouts, and so that's why we in particular will hide these dev layouts. So, for example, if we don't necessarily want these users to have access to these layouts, that's why we would maybe hide them from here. Looks like we got a couple of thoughts popping up in the chat here. Let me see if, yeah, our scripts and such are not, yep, yeah. So Phil's answered some questions related to, we don't sort alphabetically. Tobias is asking about sorting alphabetically in terms of everywhere. We don't do it everywhere. Phil's mentioning that we don't do this in our scripts list. So scripts, sometimes we'll group scripts, in folders based off of maybe sometimes related maybe to the context of maybe how they're being called in some cases, to say these are all the scripts maybe we're running from our contact view. But again, sometimes we have scripts that are not context dependent. We try to not have scripts that are context dependent. So sometimes we do have sort of modular code bases that we're trying to reuse. So maybe sometimes we're grouping them by, to say, generic or modular scripts that we're sort of using. That's sometimes way we'll kind of group these and set these, but honestly, more times than not, scripts that I create just fall to the bottom of the list, and that's when they're created, and that's when that's kind of where they're in there. Because more times than not, when I'm looking for a script, I'm either searching for it up here, or I'm already looking on a layout. Maybe I have a button that has that script assigned to it. So I'm already kind of finding the script through my UI, through the business logic that I've built elsewhere, through the interface that I have. So not always necessarily the case. Other good question here, do you check for duplicate layout names and scripts? I mean, it's probably worth noting, you do have the ability to create 2 scripts that have the same name. I personally don't really check for those things, but you can see here now I have 2 scripts with the exact same name. Which probably brings the question, well, how does FileMaker know which script I'm running? Is under the hood, FileMaker has a unique identifier, just like we have for our records, a unique identifier for each script. So if you change the name of the script at some point, FileMaker keeps track of that in the background, and it's not actually linking it by the name. But there's nothing I personally do. I mean, more than anything, I just knowingly don't create scripts by the same name. You know, obviously there's some possibility that you might just create a new script and not realize there's already a script by that name. But in general, it's not something I run into as a common problem, but something you should be aware of and that you should try to avoid doing. And same thing for layouts. Do you deliberately use duplicate layout names? Layout names, I personally don't. Obviously, in that example I did there, I was just quickly duplicating a layout and renaming it. But that's another thing to be aware of too, is you can have layouts with the same name. That can get super confusing, so I just recommend to try to avoid that as best as possible. As you can see, even when I duplicated a script just by hitting Command D, it did rename it slightly with a copy on the end. So I do know that this is a duplicate, and the same thing would happen if I were to duplicate a layout, as you saw. So some other things to kind of be aware of that gives us some things that FileMaker allows us to do. You know, something to maybe consider too is, you know, FileMaker itself, when you call a script within FileMaker, it does not, this just comes to mind now, FileMaker, you know, is going to call that script by, at least by its default nature, if I do a perform script here. When you say, for example, call it from the list, when I call a script, when I go through this scenario, it is selecting the script and it's storing it as the ID so when I do this as from list, as noted here, if I do by name, this is where things get a little hairy. If I call a script by name and I have 2 scripts that are the same name, this will possibly be a problem. Yeah, I believe in that scenario, what happens is if you do call a script by name and there's multiple scripts with that name, it's going to call the first one in the list in the script listing here on the left. That's my understanding. Feel free to correct me in the chat if I am incorrect. But try it out yourself and know the difference between the two. So that's some ideas maybe of how we would organize this. Okay, looks like another question. Maybe we can address that maybe in the discussion. We can talk about question relating to DDRs. Let me hop back.
Matt, one thing about the script names, the FileMaker server, when you do a script schedule, like a schedule run script on the server, that is only by the name. So if you rename that script, it won't work. Yes. And if you have 2 scripts by the same name, you run the wrong one.
Great
so
point,
the server's
Phil.
not using the script ID, which is kind of a pain.
Gosh, I'm so glad you're here. Now I know why. It's so nice to have you. Thank you. Awesome. Another example I can think of too, if you're doing like an FMP URL call, or you're calling a script, through the data API, similar scenario where if you're calling a script by name and you're changing the name of the script, you can run that problem. So another example too. Thank you, Phil. Thanks for reminding me. Layout objects. We don't have a ton of naming conventions. When it comes to layout objects, but maybe this is a starting point for you to kind of think about them. I'm not going to dive into an example of this, but for example, if you are naming fields on a layout, we like to use a prefix of FLD in all caps with a double underscore, TAB for naming tab objects, and then BTN for buttons. Some benefits, and this was probably in earlier versions of FileMaker where you didn't have as much of a if I go into layout mode here, hop over, oops, one moment. If I hop out here and I go into layout mode, things have changed recently. So now we have the objects, I think previously it was called the layout object attributes or something like that. I can't remember the exact name of it, but now we have its own tab here. We can type and search for objects within a layout here. this part of our naming convention is not, as you can see, as defined as other areas, because obviously there's many different types of objects that can be on our layout. You've got your fields, you've got buttons, but then you even have just text that's on the layout. You have maybe charts and graphs. You have portals, all those sort of things. So I mean, obviously, we maybe if I were to add a portal, say onto to this detail view, maybe I'd name the portal. Say an invoice record here. Just really quickly, I don't want to hear. So what we're talking about here is the naming of objects here on this tab within FileMaker. So say, for example, I want to go to a specific object that's on my layout, having some sort of, maybe it'll do, for a portal, we'll do PTL, and it'll be, and then maybe I'll try to follow the naming convention that we're using, or maybe I'll just call it the contact invoice portal. Different ways you could do it. Again, I don't really have a very stringent rule of thumb here, but some kind of way maybe to break them down. The benefit here is what you could do is, and this maybe is now not as needed, but for example, if you wanted to get a list of just all the portals, how we would previously do this, and maybe this is something we can update in our document. PTL double underscore here. Oh, a little delay on my keyboard, sorry. Yeah, do a double underscore. I could, in theory, get a list of all of the portals if I've followed my naming convention properly on my layout here. Obviously, FileMaker's made this a lot easier in newer versions, so now we have the ability to see different object types that are on our layouts. So maybe a naming convention is not so much needed anymore, possibly. When it comes to naming objects, maybe you just name them whatever is unique and special in that case. Or whatever's most descriptive to you. I'll say I would avoid using spaces though, because often I will call for these objects in my script, and maybe the benefit there is to not have any spaces, so it's easier for me to call that object within my script. So just something to kind of think about. Maybe that's something we can talk a little bit more in the group chat. Looks like some people have some ideas on that. I'd love to hear more about them. Last place, so this is one that I unfortunately probably have not followed the rules too well, but I do like sort of the way that this is laid out. Let me try to walk through sort of how we name this. So let's say, for example, the value list is based off of, is derived from actual field values, information within, an actual value within FileMaker. For example, the first one on this list is contact ID. This is going to give me just a value list of all the contact IDs that I have, so all the records there. So the benefit there then is I can know quickly that this is going to give me a list of all the contact IDs across the system, regardless of where I call it from. If I go a step down, what we have then is maybe a identifier which is separated with an underscore to say what context it's called from. Again, now we're using our table naming convention with the abbreviations that we use. So I would recommend keep these consistent. In our scenario, we did COM. So now I'm aware that from this, I'm going to see this is called from the context of the company, the main company anchor table occurrence group. And I also have an attribute to tell me what kind of contact IDs I'm getting, and it's showing me the active content IDs. Maybe there is a field on my contacts that indicate if they're active or not, and I only want to see the active ones that I'm assigning these to. So there's an example of how we would name these table occurrence groups. So again, we at the very minimum, we're identifying and naming the field that we're using here, and maybe we have some additional descriptors here too, like the last example. Maybe this is a common thing we would do in FileMaker, where we have in our value list, we have the field on the left, which is our unique identifier, our primary key, and then we have the other column is the name of the thing, like the contact's name or the company name. Put that on the other side. So in the third example at the bottom here, we're seeing this is going to be, the left field is going to be a contact ID, and it's going to be by the name of the contact. It's being called from the context of the company, and it's only going, and our attribute is it's only the active contacts. And again, we could make this a little bit longer, and we could say, instead of just active, maybe we want to give some more specificity to say active contacts from this year, or active contacts in the state of the current state that you're in, maybe. So these can get longer and they can get more descriptive, but that's sort of our three main things we would include in our value list, is a descriptor of what fields are in this value list if we're using fields. Then the context that it is called from, if there is some context-aware dependencies that we have with our value lists, and then maybe some attributes about that value list of what kind of records are we going to get from this. When it comes to value lists that are not derived from field names, maybe they're static lists that you're managing or custom value lists as you're building them. I personally don't have any specific naming convention, but I would say you maybe you want to group those together to indicate that they are that they are static lists. Maybe they're, maybe you prefix it with the word static or constant or some kind of other naming convention that you feel is appropriate. So that's something to consider maybe. That's kind of all I can think of with value lists. So kind of getting towards the end here, I got a couple more slides. I mean, we can open for discussion. I'd love to hear what you do, what each of you do for your naming conventions, if you have any. Some things I want to talk about, though, specific to why we want to do naming conventions. One, it's going to improve your speed of development. You have to put less brain power into thinking about what you're going to name, because you already sort of have a way of that you're going to name things. And eventually, these naming conventions, if you use them all the time in your work, you don't really have to think about, how do I name a script? Oh yeah, I got a whole list of scripts right here. This is how I name a script. Or how do I name layouts that are not accessible to a user? Oh, I've got a bunch right here. Your work kind of speaks for itself, and you're able to see that information more readily available. So I think there's a lot of benefits in speed and efficiency. Another example I think of, if I have a script that's named that has parameters that need to be passed, and I'm in the middle of, I'm deep within a layout, I've added a new button, I'm in the button dialog, I've selected the script, you're now like 3 windows in. And if you need to go and look at that script and examine additional parts of what I'm calling that script, you got to open that script up, and now I got to look at the script. Oh yeah, these parameters are called this and that. These are the things I pass and can't pass. If it's all in the name, and if all that metadata, that information is presented there, you know what you need to pass, you know what values you need to have, and they're already there and ready for you. So again, there's just ways you can speed up development, and it makes development more bearable, to be honest, in some cases. Sometimes it's really a pain to have to, write up all this stuff and put all this information in there. And if you're already kind of doing it, when you come back to it at a later date, you're going to go, oh yeah, that's why I did that. Code comprehension, I talked about that with naming of variables or naming of scripts is another area. You can very easily and readily know this is a variable that's doing this, that has this information stored in it, and I know I can use it somewhere else in this script. I can think of maybe many other examples where that's useful. Maybe some of you are solo developers, but I think this has sort of a two-prong approach here, is by having naming conventions in place and using them now, the benefit is other team members know the way you're going to name things, and they're also going to name things like that. And so you have a common language, a way that you are speaking to each other when you develop in FileMaker. And so this isn't something you can enforce necessarily, but I think the best way that you can do this is you have the ability to, through your actions, through the way that you develop, when you hand your code off to someone else, and maybe someone else is working on a project, or maybe you're ramping up a new employee on a project, there's a ton of time saved if you say, well, we use our naming conventions here. So all these scripts that I make, you already know how they need to be created, and how you'd create a new script, or how you're going to make this layout, or how you're going to create a new table. We already have a convention for this. We already have a way that we're going to uniquely identify these things. So that's something to consider, is, 5 years from now, you have to go look back at something that you developed back then. There are things that I do not remember doing 5 years ago. I can tell you that much. A week ago, maybe, some things I developed, some complicated scripts that I've worked in. And so having these naming conventions in place, and also comments within your code, obviously, and maybe that's a naming convention in and of itself, or more of a best practice maybe. But having a way that you do things, and that you're going to continually do them and always do them, helps in the future when you have to come back to old work and get your ramp up time, your ability to know that information so much quicker here. Looks like I'm about an hour, so I got a couple more things I'll touch on. We can open for discussion. So another thing I'd recommend is have this documented somewhere. Have a source of truth, okay? Because someday you're going to say to yourself, I think this is how I name tables. And if you don't have a place where you actually said, this is what I'm committed to, this is what I'm going to do, document it, put it somewhere. You could put this in FileMaker. You could have a FileMaker database of your naming conventions, and that maybe you have an example file, or maybe you just have it structured in a way where it's in FileMaker, and maybe you have a table of your naming conventions that are for tables, and you have all that information laid out in FileMaker. That's an option. For example, Soliant documents a lot of our information in Atlassian Confluence. That's a web-based product that we use, but there's other ones. A lot of times documentation is often in the form of a wiki. So there's free wikis out there that you can sign up for, and you can just store that in there. But for us, we often use our documentation software with Atlassian. We use it for more than just naming conventions. We're documenting things we're doing on a project, designs that we go for in a project. So if anything, maybe a naming convention gives you the goal to start documenting things more, not just inside FileMaker, but maybe, in a structured place in a wiki of some sorts. I've also been on projects too where we're sort of working with an internal developer. And so there's a benefit to documenting this and storing it somewhere and making it available publicly if you want to in some way. So that if a customer says, hey, what are your naming conventions for FileMaker? I've got this way I do it. How do you do it? And maybe I'm going to take some of your good ideas and you'll take some of mine and we'll kind of refine it together. So that's kind of how I always think about it. So some other ideas there with that is, making that stuff available to your customers or people you're working with, all the more increases this, uptake of using naming conventions and having a way that you're going to talk about FileMaker. So that's the case for naming conventions. Why I think you should do them, why I think they're great. Some challenges here, your conventions can be fluid and they're always evolving and changing. So for example, using the example of that, I've documented the way that I name tables. Well, let's say, 3 years from now, I've been convinced that there's a better way to do this and I'm going to change it. I can do that. I'll be able to change that. But then, maybe I've got some old code that I worked on a year ago and I had a different naming convention. And so this is the challenge, right? Your naming conventions are fluid. They're always evolving. But I think the benefit is that the reward is the journey, right? The benefit is that by thinking about these things and documenting them and changing over time, you become a better developer, I think. I think you learn from yourself. You learn why I don't do that anymore because I learned about this mistake that happens. And so now I've got a best practice or I've got a naming convention. And I've probably talked about best practice a lot. Maybe that's a thing that could be another topic of discussion that maybe we've talked about previously, but maybe we revisit. The other challenge too is enforcement. It's difficult to enforce naming conventions, but I think the best way to enforce a naming convention is to use naming conventions. Lead by example. Be the developer you want everyone else to be, right? And so trying to, that's a challenge, is enforcing it. But I think the benefit there is, if you show other developers that you use these naming conventions in your projects, they're going to be more inclined to use them themselves, and you sort of have this grassroots ability to create other users, have other developers, use your naming conventions and sort of start somewhere. Another thing you can talk about too is, by enforcing code reviews. Now, I'm not sure how many of you work with other developers, but the other benefit here and another way to enforce naming conventions is code reviews, which is going through someone else's code with them, have them talk about it, document it, not just scripts, but layouts and other things they developed. That's a perfect opportunity to say, hey, let's talk about naming conventions again. You named this script really wonky, and you're passing parameters different than what we talked about and what our naming convention implies. Maybe this is not a good idea. Let's revise this. Let's be uniform and committed to sort of the way that we say we're going to build and design things. So those are the things to consider about how do you enforce these things? How do you, how do you kind of make sure that naming conventions are used? And again, there is no perfect naming convention. There is no project that I've ever worked on where everything properly follows the naming convention always. Nothing's perfect. We live in an imperfect world, as we're all experiencing right now, working from home and working remotely. So it is what it is. We just have to sort of accept those things. And if we have opportunities to say, oh, this table's not named correctly, now maybe here's an opportunity, this client really wants me to make sure this stuff is uniform. Here's an opportunity for me to fix that and change that, improve that, and refine that. And obviously there are challenges when you rename tables or other things that you might want to be aware of. that you might need to run some DDR, run some database analysis to make sure that you should be renaming some things. But those are some things to consider and talk about. And the last challenge I probably would present to you is, the best time to start something was yesterday, and the next best time is right now. So if you don't have naming conventions or ways to design or an idea of how you want to do that, just get started now and start small. Maybe your only naming convention is how you name tables. Start there and say, today, going forward, this is how I'm going to name my tables. Nothing else. Start there and build from it, and then maybe look back on your previous work and say, maybe there's a naming convention here that I've already done. And to say, well, I'm already kind of doing it this way. I guess this is my naming convention. And maybe you refine it, and maybe you say, well, it's probably not exactly how I should do it. But again, to have some kind of structured way that you're doing this, it allows your brain to kind of be freed up and allowed to think more about making great solutions for your customers or for yourself or for your company, and not be tied up in sort of the syntax and the complications of all that. That sort of stuff just kind of gets ingrained into your development, and it's just the way you do things, right? So that's my kind of nice. I'm surprised. I can't believe it. Over an hour. Who knew naming conventions could be an hour topic? But I guess I found a way. So I'm going to kind of open it up for discussion and QA. Phil, however you feel you want to kind of present this, I'm open to your thoughts.
Well, let's start with, does anybody have any questions or anything they want to talk about with this, with Matt's topic first?
I don't have a question, but Matt, I just want to thank you. This is a great topic, and it's something I've been using my own naming conventions for many years and feel really comfortable with them. But you've shown me some cool new ideas for things, especially in the scripting world, as we get more and more into passing parameters and trying to do things from without context. I think this idea that the parameter in the script name just makes a whole lot of sense. And I downloaded the little thing that you gave me a link to, Phil. Thanks. I want to see how you manage passing parameters, because it's just kind of growing out of control right now, right? The whole parameter thing. So
those JSON tools that they've given us, those functions have, I think, at least for me, that's when I really started to think about, oh, we got these ways that we can sort of structure and format data and pass it through as a big blob. And no, this might make, so yeah, I think you're right. It's an interesting topic, and maybe that's something we can talk about at another point. I'd love to talk about script parameters. Woo.
The only other comment I'll make is that, I agree with just about everything you said in a lot of these areas, the anchor buoy and the naming and the way that sorts the related tables. That to me is the biggest benefit of the whole anchor buoy methodology, is that when you're looking for things, they all group together, you know exactly what's related and what's not. The one thing I'll say that I do differently, personal preference, is I like to have as close to English language as I can get, because it's hard for me to make these abbreviations. They force me to translate. So like COM underscore CON underscore whatever, and my brain has to know what they mean. So I'll just name it companies underscore contacts, companies underscore invoices, and I spell things out. They're longer, but I always know exactly what they mean, and there's never any ambiguity. And my brain cell count continues to diminish. I find that's more valuable to me than brevity.
No, that's a great point. Definitely. You're sort of extrapolating another layer there, right? You're sort of
get rid of the layers. Everything. Even field names. Name first, name last drives me crazy. First name, last name. I don't care if they're grouped together. I'm looking for something called first name. I'm going to start typing first name. I'm not going to do translation in my brain. So I would have a lot, if I were working on a Soliant project, I would have a lot of places where my brain has to translate this intermediary layer, which I don't do in my own. So, but personal preference. I love your talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Great thoughts. Thanks.
Cool.
If I can say one thing about the parameter passing on those blog posts I pointed out that I linked to. When we wrote the one where the names of the parameters were in the name of the script, that was older, before we had JSON, and there were there were actually a whole bunch of custom functions that had to pick that apart, and you had to label them as text or number in the script name. But with the JSON, which is down the list, passing parameters to JSON, it's really simple. You use JSON set element for the script parameter, and then that JSON get parameters from keys or whatever. And you don't actually need the names in the script name. You don't have the parameters in the script name. I put them in there just because it's very helpful. It's a guide, like how I need to, what parameters I need to set.
Yep.
But the JSON's much better as long as you're running FileMaker 16 or later. JSON is really the way to go.
Yep. Yeah, we've definitely had that convention in place for a while. So there's been talks on our team to consider revising it and making it more modern with JSON. The challenge can be that if heaven forbid we still have clients below FileMaker 16, which happens, you know, you're stuck maybe going back to a different naming convention or a different way of kind of passing those. So challenges, but yeah, very good point, Phil. Thanks. Thoughts, questions, feedback?
I just want to add, again, a really great talk. One of the things I like to do on the ERD for the table occurrences is if I have a table that I'm not, let's say it's a table that's somewhere down the chain that I'm going to have a lot of relationships to, but I'm not necessarily making relationship from that table somewhere else. So for example, maybe a table that is only on the right-hand side of an anchor buoy string. And that's the only thing that's there for. I'll put that TO at the top. I'll kind of put them all at the top of the table manage, you know, dialogue. And then if I do create something off that, I'll pull it off and kind of put it in within, you know, its own section. And then this might be a little retentive, but I like to use the notepad feature as well. And use that color, the same color as the TO, and then name it so that, especially as, you know, it starts to grow, I can back up, look at the word, find it, and get, you know, right in there. And then anything that's not used is just, or so to speak, isn't used, you know, on the left side of an anchor buoy, is just up and out of the way. And as soon as I have a relationship that's going to pull off of it, I'll pull it down, give it its own, you know, note area. So it's got a background and some text, and clean it up. But yeah, I just want to echo too. I've seen some other ways of doing parameter passing in scripts, and those are great. And it's really good to see too that IDs, you know, are no longer using those what'd you call those? Underscores. Thank you.
Yeah, double underscores. Yeah, definitely.
Can I throw in my 2 cents about your comment, Mike? Something you may or may not know, probably do, that when you create a calculation field in FileMaker, at the top of that calculation dialog box, it says from the context of. That from the context of is always from the first table occurrence that you created for that table. So if you start with a table that's an anchor buoy, that's a buoy table, every calculated field you create uses the context of anchor buoy, and that becomes your context. And if you make that an anchor now, they're all from that related context, and it can throw you off. So what I always do, just as a matter of course, every time I make a new table, it gets its own table occurrence. That's a base table. All my base tables are down on the left, every single one. Whether they're used or not for anything doesn't matter. So that it's always the first context. And my context for companies is always companies, and the context for contacts is always contacts, and contacts is never companies_contact as my calculation context.
Yeah, I just don't like to put them all in there. If they're not going to have a relationship to them, I just don't want to visually, it's all a visual thing, that's all. I just want to put them at the top, and then as soon as I create it, then I'll pull them in, just like you're saying. But if it's only just one, instead of having these spaces where there's a lot of relationships, one table, relationships, TO, I just like to stack them at the top, that's all. Just so visually I can, and it also tells me, like, in context, this table is not relating out. It's only being used to relate in, so to speak.
Mark, I never knew that. I never knew it was the first created TO that would go at the top there. I always wondered why it would pull strange ones, not the one. I thought it'd be the one I was on, but you're saying it's...
No, it's the first one created. Kevin Frank, I learned that from Kevin.
Makes sense.
Like doing something at some point, and all my calculations were wrong.
But you can change that, but you have to remember to change it.
But you have to go change it on every calculated field.
You have to remember, yeah.
Change the thing. Yep.
Yeah, I learned that too. Look at Phil and I learning from everyone. Thanks for sharing. Awesome.
Sweet.
I got a quick question. Does anyone use a naming convention as far as their IDs go? As far as, like, for instance, you have a company table, prepending COM to the unique identifier that follows after it, like COM underscore and then the unique identifier. We had just found with all our work with Better Forms it really was helpful when we were looking at the JSON to make sure stuff was lined up. And I know Charles Delft has actually adopted that as well for better forms on the back end too, adding so you guys do the great job of having a 3-letter name for each table, appending that to, or prepending it to your ID can pay big dividends when you're looking at big chunks of data and trying to debug stuff in that.
Interesting. So
What ID are you talking about, Chris?
Which
So
ID?
the ID for the record, rather than just having a BUU ID, we have COM_UUID for the ID for each record, and it is very helpful when you're looking at large data sets. Yeah, your primary key. When you're looking at large data sets, it was incredibly helpful.
Then it's a text field, correct?
It's a text field either way, unless you do a serial number. But we don't use we use UID, the text ones, correct? Yeah.
UIDs are usually text fields anyway.
Yeah, they have the
Right.
new one, the
But
UID number, but
They're harder to sort and index.
correct.
So it's
Correct.
both
There are some drawbacks to that. Absolutely.
I use a strictly a number for the primary key, and I have the last 2 digits unique to the table, and then I increase the serial number by 100 instead of by 1. So the last 2 digits of the primary key is always the same, and so then you could search by that. You just search
Sure.
by the last 2 digits, and you'd find everybody in that table.
interesting. Yeah.
Does that make sense? Did I explain that well enough? I don't.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that way I got a number field that I can sort better and faster. And I've seen, I did a kind of a prototype database using the 3-letter acronyms for the IDs and stuff. And then I switched over to this other way, and I could see a huge difference in performance. And obviously the first one was very complicated because we didn't know what we were building in the beginning. So I just hacked things on anywhere I could on the graph. And then I finally got to a point where I said, no, we got to rebuild this the right way. And then I started using other conventions. So there was a lot that had to do with the efficiencies improvements on the second time. But I do believe that those IDs being numbers made a big difference.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, we're just about out of time, and I just want to take a minute to thank Matt. Matt, thank you very much for presenting to us.
Yes, thank you, man.
A little bit of live clapping, some virtual clapping.
Wow.
We'll be back in 2
Thanks for
weeks.
having me.
Keep your eye on the meetup site for our next presentation on May 15th. And thank everybody for joining us for CAPTA this week.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, man.